"A man like you needs a woman like me," the Apache woman told the rancher who had just dragged her out of the killing storm. She changed his life forever. What began as a desperate act of survival on the Llano Estacado would crack open a heart that Eli Hartman had sealed shut for 2 long years. A half-buried woman in the sand. A ranch on the edge of ruin. 2 people from different worlds who would learn, slowly and stubbornly, that grief doesn't care what side of the frontier you come from. This is the story of Eli Hartman, a widowed sheep and horse rancher in New Mexico Territory in the year 1884. A man hollowed out by loss, clinging to land and routine because that was all that was left. And Doli, a Mescalero Apache weaver, separated from her band by the worst sandstorm the Llano Estacado had seen in a decade. When the storm passed, she would make him an offer he didn't know how badly he needed. Watch till the end. Like this video and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The storm didn't give any warning. It came out of the southwest like a curtain pulled across the earth, a wall of red-brown sand maybe 200 feet high, rolling fast over the caprock. Eli saw it from the top of the ridge where he'd been checking the water hole by the far playa. He had maybe 3 minutes before it swallowed him whole. He pulled his bandana up over his nose, turned his horse toward the draw, and rode hard. The wind hit before he made it back. It came in sideways, stinging, getting into his eyes, inside his collar, between his teeth. He couldn't see the fence posts 10 yards ahead. He couldn't see anything but red. He nearly ran his horse over her. The animal reared back, nearly threw him, and when Eli got her under control, he dropped from the saddle and went to his knees in the sand. What he'd thought was a bundle of old saddle leather wedged against the base of a mesquite thicket was a woman. She was half buried. Her hair was matted with grit, and her face was turned to one side as if she'd tried to press it into the ground to breathe. One arm was stretched out ahead of her, and it was still moving very slightly, like she was trying to crawl. He didn't think. He just worked. He got his hands under her shoulders and pulled her up, and she was heavier than he expected. Dead weight. The sand holding on. He got her to his horse, got her up across the saddle somehow, and led the animal by the reins back toward the ranch house with the wind screaming in his ears. She was breathing when he got the door shut behind them. He laid her on the floor near the stove because the floor was flat and the cot was too far. He got the sand out of her airways. She coughed hard, then went limp again. Her clothes were mescalero, a doeskin dress with beadwork along the yoke, fringe at the hem. Her moccasins were hand-sewn and worn to thin. She was younger than he'd thought out there in the dark, early 20s maybe. A weaving bag was still strapped across her body, protected by the way she'd fallen. Eli did what he would have done for any creature caught in that storm. He brought her water, a little at a time. He got a wool blanket over her. He built the stove up and let the heat into the room. He did not think about what she was or where she'd come from. He thought about getting her through the night. She woke some time after midnight. He was sitting in the chair by the stove with a cup of cold coffee in his hand when he heard her move. He turned, careful, not wanting to startle her, and found her sitting up on the floor with the blanket around her shoulders, looking straight at him. Her eyes were very dark and very alert. He said, in the plainest English he had, "You're safe. The storm's past. I found you in the sand." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said in English that surprised him more than the storm had, "I know what you did." He didn't answer that. "A man like you," she said, "needs a woman like me." He stared at her. He thought maybe she was still out of her head from the ordeal. He said, carefully, "Ma'am, you don't know anything about me." She didn't look like someone who was going to agree. She looked like someone who'd already made up her mind about something and was only telling him as a courtesy. "You live alone," she said. "Your horses are thin, your fence lines are falling. The playa near the north ridge is dry. I saw it 2 days ago when I passed, and you did not ask my name before you dragged me out of the ground." He almost laughed, he didn't. "Eli Hartman," he said. "Doli," she said. He gave her more water, and she drank it. She didn't say anything else that night, and neither did he. By morning the storm had blown itself out and left the Llano Estacado clean and scoured and very quiet. The mesquite was plastered with red dust. The caprock to the east caught the early light and glowed. It was the kind of morning New Mexico Territory could throw at you, when it felt like it, the kind that made you forget for a few minutes how hard the land was trying to kill you the night before. Eli went out to check the horses. When he came back to the house, Doli was standing at his stove making something in the one pot he owned. She'd found his dried corn and some dried herbs from somewhere, her weaving bag, he realized, and she was stirring them together with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing it every morning of her life. He said, "You don't need to do that." She handed him a bowl. It was a thin porridge, corn and something earthy and slightly bitter that he didn't recognize. He ate it. It was better than what he usually made. "I was separated from my band 2 days ago," she said, standing by the window looking out at the flat land, near the escarpment north of the Pecos. "The storm changed direction fast. Your people will be looking for you. They will look, but not here. They will look east, toward the Guadalupes." She turned and looked at him directly. "I cannot walk back in 3 days. Not across the Llano, not without water." He thought about that. His water situation was already bad. The playa was down. The main well was pumping slow, and he had 30 head of sheep and 11 horses that needed more water than he could reliably give them. He thought about the woman he'd buried 2 years back, about the 2 years he'd spent trying to keep this place going on his own, about how the banker from Las Cruces was going to ride out within the month to talk about the note. "You can stay a few days," he said. "I'll get you a horse when you're ready to go." She looked at him like she'd expected exactly that answer. "You have thistle along the north draw," she said, "and narrow-leaf yucca at the base of the caprock. Do you know what they tell you?" He didn't. "Water," she said. "Underground, not deep. 30, maybe 40 feet. Your people dig with metal, but you don't know where to dig. My people have known this Llano for 300 years. I can show you." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not in the habit of taking water advice from people I pulled out of the sand yesterday." She almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but something near it. "No," she said, "I suppose you're not." He did not take her water advice that day. He was not the kind of man who moved fast on things. He'd learned that about himself during 2 years of grief. He moved slow. He thought too much, and he came to the right answer later than he should have. His wife, Margaret, had told him that more than once. She'd told him with a kind of fond exasperation that made him miss her so badly. Some mornings he had to walk out to the far fence just to have somewhere to put it. The first 3 days, Doli stayed in the house like a guest. She was clean, she was quiet, and she did not ask for anything. She ate what he gave her, slept on the cot he moved to the corner, and spent her hours working at a half-finished weaving she'd been carrying in her bag. The shuttle moved through the warp threads with a precision that was almost mechanical. He watched her sometimes without meaning to, the way her hands moved, how she never looked down at the work. On the 4th day he found her out behind the barn. She had one of his horses, the bay gelding with the swollen left front fetlock, the one he'd been trying to figure out for 3 weeks, and she had the leg elevated on her knee and was packing something around the joint. A poultice, dark green, wet-smelling. "What are you putting on him?" he said. "Yucca-root, ground and mashed with water. And some of this." She held up a small folded cloth that smelled of something pine-sharp. "From the pinion. Your horse has been walking on stones. There is bruising, not bone. He will be sound in 4 days." "That's my horse," he said. She set the leg down gently and looked at Eli over the horse's back. "He was in pain," she said, "and you were going to have someone shoe him next week. Shoeing a bruised foot makes it worse." She picked up her cloth and walked past him toward the house. 4 days, she said again. The bay was sound in 5. Close enough. It was the horse that broke him open a little. Not all the way. Eli Hartman didn't come apart easily. But it cracked something. He started watching her more carefully after that. Watching the way she moved around the ranch, the things she noticed that he'd stopped seeing. The gap in the north fence where the older ewes were getting out. The catch basin that needed to be resloped. The way the wind came across the draw in the afternoons, and where you'd want to plant if you were going to plant anything. She wasn't staying in the house like a guest anymore. She was walking the land like someone who owned it. He asked her, one evening while she was sitting near the stove with the weaving on her lap, if she'd found water. She looked up. "You want to try it now?" he said. "I want to understand it." She took him out the next morning at dawn before the heat came up. She walked him to the north draw, and showed him the thistle clusters and explained slowly not condescending, the way you'd explain something to someone you thought was capable of understanding, that where those plants grew dense near the base of a slope, they were tracking subsurface moisture. She showed him the narrow-leaf yucca at the caprock's base and how its roots went sideways before they went down. She crouched and showed him the color difference in the soil. "Here," she said, "maybe 40 feet." He marked the spot with a cairn of flat rocks. He didn't say much, but he built the cairn carefully, which she noticed. The digging took 4 days, him and the one hand he could afford, who came in Tuesdays and Fridays, a Mexican boy named Teo, who was 16 and didn't talk much. They hit water at 38 feet. It was slow at first, seeping, and then it came up clear and cold, and Eli stood at the top of the shaft and felt something in his chest he hadn't felt in a long time. Something unclenched. He went back to the house and told Doli they'd found it. She said, "I know." She was cutting dried chilies at the table, and she did not look up, but he could see from where he stood that she was pleased. There was a night about 3 weeks in, he'd stopped thinking about her as a temporary guest somewhere around day 10, and he wasn't sure what he thought of her now when he asked her about her band. The Mescalero lived out of the Sierra Blanca country mostly. He knew that much, and some bands ranged as far as the Guadalupes. They'd been badly broken up in the 1870s, the agency at Tularosa, and then the reservation at South Fork. He didn't pretend he understood all of it. He just knew the land had changed, and the people on it had changed with it, and not by their own choosing. "My father was a diyin," she said. She was looking at the fire. Outside, the wind was doing what it did at night on the Llano, pushing against the shutters, looking for a way in. A healer. He knew plants the way your people know maps. He died at the agency. They gave us food that made people sick. Her voice was even, not angry, which somehow made it heavier. "My mother weaves. I weave. It is how we keep things. Our stories are in the patterns. Every color means something. Every crossing of the thread." He didn't say he was sorry. He'd learned that saying sorry about things you didn't do and couldn't fix just filled the air with noise. Instead, he said, "What does that one mean?" And he pointed at the weaving on the table. She told him. She talked about the design for a long time, the red that meant mountain, the pattern of interlocked angles that her mother called the path between the worlds, the pale yellow border that was the color of the first light. He listened without interrupting, which he could tell surprised her. When she stopped talking, there was a silence between them that wasn't uncomfortable. "My wife's name was Margaret," he said. He hadn't said her name out loud to anyone since the funeral. "She died of fever, the spring of '82. We'd only been here 2 years. She's buried on the South Ridge." Doli looked at him. She didn't say she was sorry either. "Did she like this land?" she asked. He thought about it. Honestly, not the fast answer. "She didn't love it," he said, "but she was proud of staying." Doli was quiet for a moment. "That is something," she said. He understood that she meant it, that she was not diminishing Margaret, but acknowledging her, and the understanding of that moved through him slow and warm like the stove's heat. He got up and put more wood in the stove, and when he sat back down, the silence had changed. It had gone from the silence of 2 people tolerating each other to the silence of 2 people comfortable enough to stop filling the air. He'd forgotten that silence could feel like that. There were things about the Llano Estacado that Doli had only begun to learn in his head. The way it held heat and released it at night. The temperature dropping so fast you could feel it in your joints. The way the playas caught rainwater and what lived in them and how long they lasted depending on where they sat in relation to the caprock. The medicinal plants, she knew them by Mescalero name, and she taught him the Spanish and English names when she knew them. And when she didn't, they made up a name together that usually made Teo laugh when he heard it. She started working the horses, not in the way Eli worked them, which was patience and rope and enough time. She worked them in a way he couldn't quite describe, something quieter than quiet, a kind of presence. She'd stand in the corral with one of the wilder young mares, not doing anything visible, just standing, and after a while the mare would come to her. He asked her once what she was doing. "Listening," she said. "Horses don't talk." She gave him a look that was equal parts amusement and pity. "Everything talks," she said. "You just have to get quiet enough." He tried to get quiet enough. It was harder than it sounded when your head had been full of worry and grief and numbers for 2 years. but he tried. The town of Callahan Wells was 6 miles east on the trail. It was not a big town. A general store, a smithy, a church, a saloon that doubled as the post office, and a scatter of homesteads around it. Eli went in every 2 or 3 weeks for supplies and mail, and to pay on his account at Fenwick's store. He was not a sociable man, and the town did not particularly seek him out. When he came in with Doli the first time, she needed calico thread and he needed flour and salt, and he saw no reason to pretend she wasn't on the ranch. He felt the shift in the room before anyone said anything. Fenwick's wife, Agnes, stopped stacking cans and watched. The 2 men by the cold stove watched. Fenwick himself watched from behind the counter with his face arranged in an expression that was trying to be neutral and wasn't quite making it. "This is Doli," Eli said simply. "She's been helping on the ranch." Nobody said anything directly. But on the way out, one of the men by the stove said something low to the other. One, and they both laughed. Doli walked out ahead of Eli with her back straight and her chin level, looking at nothing in particular, and the dignity in the way she walked through that door made him angry in a way he hadn't expected. He didn't say anything in the wagon. Neither did she. A mile down the trail she said, "You should not have brought me. You needed thread," he said. "I can do without thread." "I can't do without the flour," he said. "So we were going anyway." She was quiet. Then, "Their thoughts will follow you home. They can follow me home," he said. "I don't have to invite them in." She looked at him from the side. Something passed across her face that he couldn't read fully. She turned back to the trail ahead. He didn't go to town again for 3 weeks after that. When he did, he went alone and he heard a few things he'd expected to hear. The widow Caulfield at the well had opinions, and so did the man from the land office. And he let them bounce off him the way the Llano wind bounced off the caprock, spending itself against something that wasn't going to move. The threat came from farther away than town gossip. A man named Gideon Pearce rode up to the ranch on a Thursday afternoon in late August. He had 2 men with him. They sat their horses at the gate, and did not come through it, which Eli recognized as the kind of courtesy that didn't cost anything and usually preceded something that would. Pearce was a debt collector out of Las Cruces, working for the bank that held Eli's note. The note wasn't due until October. Pearce said he understood that. He also said he'd been authorized to discuss an early arrangement, which meant the bank had decided it wanted the land before the note came due, and was going to make the arithmetic go their way by finding violations in the fine print. "I understand you're running horses on this land," Pearce said, looking at the corral. "The note specifies sheep operations. Addition of a horse herd constitutes a material change under the terms." Eli knew what it meant. He'd talked to a man in Las Cruces who knew the law better than he did, and the man had told him it was a stretch, but a stretch that had worked before. He said, "The horses have been here since before I signed." "That may be so," Pearce said pleasantly, "but whether the bank sees it that way is another matter. I'd hate to see a good man lose his land over a misunderstanding. Perhaps if we talked about the terms." Eli looked at him. "I'll talk to my lawyer," he said. Pearce smiled like a man who'd heard that before. "Of course," he said. He touched his hat brim, and the 3 of them rode back down the trail. Doli had watched from the doorway of the barn. When Eli came back, she came out to meet him. "He will come back," she said. "I know. Not alone next time." He hadn't said that, but he'd thought it. "What makes you say that?" The way the second man looked at the horses. She watched the dust of their departure settle on the trail. He was counting them. He felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. A week later, Eli rode to Las Cruces and spent 2 days and $40 he didn't have talking to a lawyer named Arrieta, who drew up a set of papers establishing the horse operation, had predated the note signing and requesting that the bank produce any evidence to the contrary. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was something. When he got back, Doli had repaired the west fence line, all of it. 300 yards, the posts reset, the wire restrung tight. Teo said she'd done most of it while Eli was gone, working from dawn to past dark. He stood and looked at it for a while. She came and stood beside him. They looked at the fence together. "You didn't have to do that," he said. He nodded. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, without looking at her, "Why are you still here, Doli?" She didn't answer right away. The wind moved across the Llano and flattened the short grass, and came up the draw and pulled at her hair. She was watching the flat horizon the way she sometimes did, like she could read it. "My people are 2 weeks east," she said. "I could go to them. I know the way now that the rains have started, and the playas are holding." She paused. "But the ranch needs things I know, and you are not yet sure that you are worth the trouble." He turned and looked at her. She wasn't looking at him. Her face was very still. "That is the real problem," she said. "Not the note, not the fence, not even the horses." She finally looked at him. Her eyes were steady and darker than the late sky behind her. "You think that because you lost your wife, you lost your right to any of this, the land, the horses, someone beside you." She held his gaze. "You are wrong." He didn't answer. He couldn't. Something had come loose in his throat. She turned and walked back toward the house. That night he sat outside long after supper, on the step, in the dark that came down heavy and starred on the Llano. The sky out there was enormous. Enormous enough to make a man feel small, which he sometimes needed because small meant you weren't the heaviest thing in the world, and some of the weight you were carrying might not be yours to carry. He thought about Margaret. He thought about how she'd come out west because he'd asked her to, because he'd had a dream he'd laid at her feet, and she'd picked it up without complaint. He thought about how her grave was on the south ridge, facing east, and how she'd have liked to have seen the country she was buried in, really liked it, if she'd had more time. He thought about Doli's hands on the fence wire, the way she'd taught him to hear the underground water, the way she'd walked out of that store in Callahan Wells with her back straight and never said a word about what the men by the stove had said. He thought about being wrong, about whether you lost your right to things because you lost things, or whether the losing was just the cost of being on the earth and the earth still expected you to stand up in the morning. He went inside. She was at the table with the weaving. He sat down across from her. He said, "I'm going to put the new well in before the dry season, the one you found." She kept working. She said, "Good. And I'm going to talk to Teo about staying on full-time come spring. I can't pay him much, but I can give him the room in the barn." She said, "Also good." He was quiet. Then he said, "You were right about what you said." She looked up. He didn't look away. "I've been acting like a man who was done," he said. "I wasn't sure I wasn't." She held his eyes for a moment. The stove put a glow across the table between them, and it sat there like something third in the room. She looked back down at the weaving. "You aren't done," she said. He almost said something else. He didn't. He got up and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat back down, and the silence that came back was the good kind of silence, the kind that had something in it. Gideon Pearce came back on a Saturday in September, before the first real cold. He brought 6 men this time instead of 2. They came down the trail at noon. No hurry. 5 of them fanned out behind him and 1 more swinging wide to come around the east side of the property. Not a collector's visit. Something different. Eli saw them coming from the roof where he'd been fixing a loose shingle. He came down fast and went inside. Doli was already at the window. She'd seen them before he had. 6, she said. "The one going east is trying to come up on the corral. I see him." Eli got his rifle down from the rack and checked it. "Pearce is going to say he's here to inspect the property. That's going to be the pretext. And the others? They want the horses. The 11 good horses are worth more than the note." He looked at her. "Go into the back room. There's a bar for the door." She looked at him like he'd said something deeply unreasonable. "Doli, I am not going into the back room," she said, with a calm that was somehow more alarming than anger. She went to the corner where he kept the old Henry rifle he hadn't touched in a year, and she picked it up and checked it, too, quick and certain the way she'd done everything else on this ranch. "How many rounds?" He stared at her for a moment. 15 in the magazine. "And you have your Winchester." She went to the window and looked out. "They are still on the trail. They have not spread yet. Doli, you don't need to be part of this." She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face he'd seen before but hadn't named, until right now, a quality that was not anger and not fear and not bravado. It was decision. Clean, clear, final decision. "Eli," she said, "this is my ranch, too." He held her eyes. He didn't argue. Pearce came up to the gate and called out, and Eli went to the door and told him to state his business. Peirce said he was there on behalf of the bank to do a property inspection under the terms of the note. Eli said the bank had no right to inspect the property before the note came due. Peirce said he had a paper from the lawyer in Las Cruces. The man who'd gone east around the property had stopped moving. He was sitting his horse at the far edge of the corral, just watching. Eli saw him. Doli was at the side window, and she saw him too. The standoff lasted the better part of an hour. Hot, still the kind of afternoon the Llano delivered in September, when the summer wasn't quite ready to let go. Nobody fired anything. Nobody moved far from where they'd been. What broke it was the dust from the northwest. It came up fast, the kind of dust that meant horses, multiple horses, moving hard. Everybody saw it at the same time. Eli and Peirce and all 6 of Peirce's men. The cloud was still a mile out, but it was coming direct. Doli, from the window, made a sound that wasn't quite a word, a single syllable low in her throat. She gripped the windowsill with one hand. They came into view in another few minutes. 15 riders, Apache Mescalero by their dress, moving fast down from the northwest, which was the direction of the Guadalupes and the escarpment, and the places where Doli's band ranged. They pulled up at the edge of the property and sat their horses, and the silence that came with them was a different kind of silence from the silence of the standoff. Peirce looked at them. He looked at the 6 men he'd brought. He looked back at them. The man who'd gone around to the east of the property was the first to move. He reined his horse around, slow the way a man moves when he's trying not to look like he's running, and started back down the trail toward Callahan Wells. One of the other men followed, then another. Peirce sat a moment longer. He looked at Eli. He said, "This isn't over, Hartman." Eli said, "You're welcome to come back with the proper papers." Peirce turned his horse and went. His last man followed. After they'd gone a quarter mile, Eli let himself breathe. He looked at the riders on the ridge. One of them separated from the group and came forward slowly, an older man, lean and weathered, on a dark horse. He called out in Mescalero, something short. Doli answered from the window. A short exchange. Her voice had changed, not smaller, bigger, fuller. She was talking to someone who knew her in a way the ranch did not yet. The older man on the dark horse looked at Eli for a long time. Then he said something else, in Spanish this time, that Eli caught most of. Something like, "She said you would be worth finding." Eli looked back at him. He said, in Spanish, she was right about most things. The rider almost smiled. He turned his horse and went back to the group, and they stayed on the ridge for a while. And then one by one they moved off to the northwest unhurried, back the direction they'd come. When Eli came inside, Doli was standing in the middle of the room. The Henry rifle was back on the rack. Her weaving bag was on the table, and she was looking at it. "Your people," he said. "My uncle," she said. "He's been looking since the storm. I asked last week when Teo went to the trading post. I asked Teo to get a message north. I wasn't sure it would reach. He understood. She'd been planning for this without telling him, because the plan was hers to make. She'd called her people not to rescue her, but to change the odds. They will go back to the Guadalupes," she said. "My mother is there. She'll be worried," he said. "You should go with them." The room was very still. She turned and looked at him. He could see the dust still settling on the trail outside through the window behind her, and the late afternoon light coming in flat and golden, and she was standing in it in a way that made something in his chest squeeze hard. "If I go," she said, "I'll come back." He held her eyes. "I know," he said. That was all he said, but it was enough, because she understood what was in it, that he wasn't asking her to stay, and wasn't asking her to go, and wasn't trying to hold anything that wasn't his to hold, that he was going to be here when she came back, because he was going to keep being here. He'd made that decision somewhere between the fence repair and the water and the night on the step, and he hadn't said it aloud until now. She picked up her weaving bag. She looked around the room, his room, now hers too in some way that neither of them had named. She looked at the stove and the table and the rack where the rifles hung. "The bay gelding will need the yucca poultice again come spring," she said. "Right rear this time. He favors it. I'll watch for it." He said. She went to the door. Then she turned around. She was looking at him with something that was steady and warm and completely sure of itself, the same way she'd looked at him that first morning when she'd handed him the bowl of porridge and said 4 days and meant it. "Eli Hartman," she said, "you are a man who deserves to be on this land. You are a man who deserves to have someone standing beside him." A pause. "Don't waste the winter convincing yourself otherwise." He couldn't speak. He nodded. She went out. He watched her from the door, her crossing the yard, the weaving bag over her shoulder, moving with the particular unhurried purpose that was entirely hers. And then he couldn't see her any more, and he stood there in the doorway for a while, with the Llano open in front of him, flat and enormous, the caprock glowing pink in the last of the light, the well cairn visible on the north ridge. He built the well that October. Teo stayed on through the winter in the barn room. The sheep were healthy. The horses gained weight on the grass that came up after the fall rains. The lawyer Arietta sent word that the bank had dropped its inspection claim when they'd learned about the documentation. Spring came slow across the Llano, the way it always did, the playa filling by March and the first green showing in the draw by April. Eli fixed the barn door that had been off-hinged since before Margaret died. He planted a kitchen garden on the south side of the house the way he'd been meaning to for 2 years. Small things. The things a man does when he's decided to be somewhere. She came back in May, when the mesquite was in flower. He heard the horse first, single set of hooves coming down the trail from the northwest. Unhurried. He was at the well, checking the casing, and he straightened up and turned and looked north, and saw her coming down through the mesquite in the morning light, her weaving bag across her back, and a new blanket, deep red and white, rolled and tied to her saddle. He walked out to meet her. He didn't run. Neither did she. But there was something in both of them that had been pointed at this moment for a long time. She pulled up and looked at him from the horse. He looked up at her. "Well," she said, "you're still here." "I told you I would be," he said. "You didn't say it in words." "No," he admitted. "I didn't." She looked at the garden on the south side of the house. She looked at the new well casing on the north ridge. She looked at the horses, fat and glossy. She looked at the barn door, hanging straight and true. "You were busy," she said. "Trying to deserve it," he said. She was quiet. Then she stepped down from the horse and stood in front of him, and he was close enough to see the line of beadwork on her collar, and the dust of the trail on her moccasins, and her eyes looking at him the way they'd looked at him from that first morning in his house, with the decision already made. He reached out and took her hand. Just her hand, the way two people hold on when they're deciding to hold on. "I have something to ask you," he said. She waited. "I don't have much. The land is good, but it's not easy. The town doesn't have much use for me, and has even less for what they'd say about this." He felt the roughness of his own thumb against the back of her hand. "I know that, and I know your people have their own home and their own ways, and I'm not asking you to leave any of that behind, but I'm asking you to." He stopped. Tried again. "I'm asking if a woman like you would have a man like me." She looked at him for a long moment. The mesquite blossoms smelled sweet in the warm air. Somewhere down the draw, a meadowlark was doing what meadowlarks do at the beginning of May, on the Llano Estacado, which is sing as if the land belongs entirely to them. "I told you from the first morning," she said, "a man like you needs a woman like me." She took his hand back with both of hers. "I said yes, then," she said. "I'm still saying yes." The caprock to the east caught the light and glowed the way it did on good mornings, which was every morning if you made the choice to see it that way. Eli Hartman stood on the land that was his, beside the woman who had told him what he needed before he knew it himself, and for the first time in a long time he was not hollow. He was not a man going through the motions of a life he'd already lost. He was a man who had been found, not by a storm, by the woman the storm had brought him. Some people talked in Callahan Wells for a while. They always do, but the seasons move across the Llano Estacado regardless, and the sheep do well, and the horses are the best horses in that stretch of New Mexico territory, and the well on the north ridge never runs dry. And in the spring mornings when the mesquite is in flower, two people walk the land together, the rancher who learned to listen to the earth, and the woman who already knew what it was saying, and the silence between them is the comfortable kind, the kind that has something in it, the kind that means they're home.